For more scary stories and spooky videos, be sure to hit subscribe and click that notification bell. Now sit back and relax, and remember to always stay hungry. Number 1. Back when I was in middle school, our normal teacher for one of our classes randomly quit for some reason. A substitute teacher was issued to our class until they could find a permanent replacement. We were sitting in class one day waiting for it to begin, and the substitute teacher came walking in. He looked to be a man around 30 years old and had a very serious look on his face. The only thing he said to us when he walked in was, "You can address me as sir." All of the students became a bit uncomfortable, as his presence alone was very intimidating. Several of the students asked him questions in very polite, appropriate ways. Each time one of them did this, though, the teacher replied to them, making it sound like their questions were stupid. One of the nicest girls in my class had approached him and asked if she could close the window that he had opened. She sat directly next to the window and it was winter, so it was very cold outside. He then mumbled something to her and she was apparently under the impression that he had given her permission to close it. She went up to the window and began to try and pull it shut. The teacher noticed this and quickly stormed over to her. The substitute teacher became so angry that he actually pushed the poor girl out of the window. Luckily, we were on the ground floor, so there wasn't much of a fall, but still, we were all in shock and the girl fell outside and into the snow. When she got up, several students rushed over her to try and help her back inside, but the teacher didn't allow any of us to do this. She was forced to walk around the entire school without a coat on just to get back into the classroom. The rest of the class was uneventful, but the teacher was still being aggressive and just weird. Once the class ended, several students and I decided that we needed to go speak with the principal about everything that had happened. By the time we got to his office, the teacher was already in his office. The two of them seemed to be getting to know each other and were laughing about something. They seemed to be getting along pretty well. The other students and I tried telling the principal about what happened during class, but the teacher just laughed it off and talked about how students come up with the craziest stories. Needless to say, nothing ever came of what happened. Luckily, a few weeks later, the teacher ended up getting fired for unrelated reasons. It turned out that he had served in the military and apparently once he returned home, he had some issues he was trying to work through. He ended up becoming a substitute teacher, which was obviously not a good fit for him. Number 2. When I was in high school, I would have to spend a lot of the school year of being homeschooled for various reasons. Teachers from my school would come to my house regularly during these periods to help me get through the school year. Most of the time, it would be one of my regular teachers from school. Occasionally, these particular teachers wouldn't be available, so a substitute teacher from within the school district would be sent instead. It was always a bit uncomfortable when a random person would show up, but I never really felt creeped out until I met one particular person. I will call him Mr. A. I was 16 years old at the time, and for reference, I'm a female. The first time Mr. A showed up to my house, I got a very weird vibe from him. He was an upper middle-aged man. Every time he came to my house, he rode his bike to get there. I found this a little bit odd as he didn't live very close to me, but I just assumed he was one of those people that were really into riding his bike. He started coming over pretty regularly to tutor me, and things got progressively weirder. When he found out that I played lacrosse, he asked if that was the sport that girls wore skirts in, and said that I must look pretty good in the uniform. He would also say things like that a girl my age shouldn't date boys my age, and that older men were more suitable candidates. He even started buying me things, which I would always throw out due to how creepy the entire thing was. The final straw was when he came over one evening for another tutoring session. We were sitting at the table, which is where all the tutoring took place. Mr. A was talking to me when suddenly his eyes slowly closed and his head slumped down towards his chest. I tried asking him if he was okay, but he wouldn't respond. I was panicked. I then ran upstairs to try to tell my mom what was going on. She apparently thought I was exaggerating the situation as she didn't seem very alarmed by this information. I went back downstairs to check on Mr. A and he was still in the same condition. I walked over to him when suddenly he lifted his head back up and continued talking, as if nothing ever happened. I was in complete shock and just super freaked out by the entire situation. He ended up leaving not too long after. That ended up being the very last time Mr. A ever came to tutor me. From that point forward, the school district has always sent someone else. Although I was relieved, I was still a bit curious as to what happened to him. My mom eventually ran into someone else that happened to know Mr. A. Apparently, he had a drug and alcohol problem that no one ever knew about. Due to multiple DUIs, he no longer had a license and was forced to ride his bike everywhere he went. The last we heard, he ended up in rehab. I hope he got some help and is doing a lot better now, but either way, drugs or not, that guy was a total creep. Number 3. When I was 12 years old and in the 6th grade, I was a pretty social person. I should note that I'm a girl. I would often spend time in class talking and I would always get in trouble with my teacher regularly. A lot of the time I would get sent to a different class to do my schoolwork. The class was several grades below me, so my teacher thought I would focus on getting work done instead of talking to my friends. The teacher of this class was someone I'll refer to as Mr. Anderson. He was always super nice and friendly to me. Anytime I got sent to his class, I never felt uncomfortable or like I was some sort of a burden. When I was outside for recess or at lunch, Mr. Anderson would occasionally spend time in the same area as my friends and I. He would sometimes talk to us and other times just stand near us. At the time, he was just a teacher I really liked, and there wasn't anything he did that made me feel weird or uncomfortable. Looking back though, his behavior was definitely a little weird at the very least. Back at this point in my life, I had an AOL email account and would use it to talk to my friends when we weren't at school. One day though, I randomly got a message from someone telling me they were a 16-year-old boy. It's been a long time, so I forget how he told me he came across my email address, but at the time I didn't question it. We spoke pretty regularly for quite a long time. After about 2 years of talking, I had moved to a different part of the country. I still spoke with the boy that had been emailing me, but things he would write to me became more and more inappropriate. I was still pretty young at this point, and a lot of it seemed pretty creepy, but most of it I didn't even really understand. Some more time passed, and eventually this 16-year-old boy emailed me telling me that my favorite teacher, Mr. Anderson, was very sick. This struck me as very odd because I had never talked to this boy about anything personal in my life. I didn't talk about where I went to school, who my teachers were, or anything else of that nature. I suddenly came to the realization that it must have been Mr. Anderson himself that had been emailing me this entire time. There's no other explanation for how this person would have this information. To this day, I'm still not sure how he got my email address, but I would often write notes to people giving them my email address, and these notes would get confiscated pretty regularly. It's also possible that maybe he overheard me tell it to one of my friends when he was hovering around my friends and I. I stopped replying to this person's emails from that point on, and he eventually stopped emailing me. It's been years and years since this happened, and I never found out what happened to Mr. Anderson. Number 4. When I first started college, I was looking into classes that I had to take for the degree I was pursuing. I ended up taking a sociology course. As a freshman, I was meeting a ton of new people, and eventually met a girl named Sarah. Sarah and I became very good friends very fast. We always sat next to each other in the sociology class. The professor of the class was a man that seemed to be extremely passionate about sociology, which was a good sign. The class itself was actually very interesting. It fascinated me more to learn more about human behavior and what makes people do what they do. Sarah and I were always very involved in the class, and always took opportunities to become engaged in discussions. Our professor seemed to take a liking to us, which was more than likely because of how active we were in his class. Our class was pretty small and happened to only consist of only females. The professor mentioned that he thought it was so cool to be teaching a class of only women. He was the kind of guy that just seemed like a free spirit, so when he said things like this, it didn't come off as being something off-putting. About halfway through the semester, my entire class was invited to come up to his cabin for the weekend. It definitely seemed a little odd at first, but most of us agreed to go, including Sarah and I. The cabin was about an hour away, and our professional supplied all of the food and everything else we would need for the weekend. Since his wife was also attending with us, it seemed a lot less strange than it would have been if she wasn't there. Overall, the weekend was pretty nice. We all just hung out, ate food, and had a pretty good time. Our professor would become a little touchy with us, but nothing too serious. He would occasionally rest a hand of his on our shoulder, but nothing that was super inappropriate. I think we all just kind of thought it was just a trait of his personality. Eventually, the semester came to an end. In order to further pursue my major, I had to switch to a different university. Sarah and I were both a little upset that we wouldn't be attending school together anymore, but we remained very close friends. Sarah ended up taking another course under our old professor, and things were going well for both of us. That was until one day when Sarah texted me. She asked me if I heard about what happened to our old professor. I had no clue, so I asked her to elaborate. I found out that our old professor was at a school convention. He had asked a female student that was involved with the event to meet him at his hotel room so that they could do some of the planning, and she agreed. Apparently, when she arrived at his hotel room, he told her to come in after she knocked. When she walked in, the professor was naked. He claimed he had just stepped out of the shower, apologized, and said he would hurry up and finish getting dressed. The girl was definitely unnerved, but agreed to wait for him. A few minutes later, he approached the girl. At this point, he told her he was in love with her and that he wanted her to join he and his wife in bed. Of course, the girl declined. She reported this incident to the school, and our professor ended up being questioned, and he didn't even try to deny any of the accusations. Needless to say, the professor didn't end up continuing to work at the school. It's just so weird to think about all of his strange remarks and gestures now knowing what I know about him. What a creep. Number 5. When I was a freshman in high school, I had a very creepy experience with a teacher. Let's just call him Mr. Smith. I developed physically pretty early on, so for the years prior to this, I had gotten used to weird and inappropriate remarks from others. This actually caused me a lot of emotional problems and caused me to lose a lot of confidence. I went from someone who was outgoing and confident to someone who was quiet and literally didn't have any friends. I would eat alone, sit in class alone, and walk the halls alone. I was basically invisible at the school. Mr. Smith seemed to notice this and went out of his way to spend time with me. At first, it was actually pretty nice. He seemed like he just cared about me and didn't want me to have to spend all of my time by myself. Eventually, he asked me if I wanted to start eating lunch with him in his classroom, rather than sitting in the lunchroom by myself. I was happy to take him up on his offer, as it got me out of the horribly awkward situation of sitting by myself while the other students would occasionally look at me and laugh. Mr. Smith would put a movie on and we would eat lunch together. It was great, but it soon began to get weird. One day during lunch, we were watching a movie when an intimate scene came on. It was quite explicit too. I just pretended that I didn't really mind and it was just a scene from a movie. But from that point on, every time I went to eat lunch, a movie would be playing that included a scene like that. It seemed like he almost made sure to time it out that way. It made me very uncomfortable, but it still got me out of having to eat lunch in the lunchroom. Eventually, the school year came to an end. The last time I ate lunch with Mr. Smith, a movie scene came on that was much more intense than the others. It made me extremely uncomfortable. I tried looking anywhere but the screen and I felt a hand on my thigh. It was of course Mr. Smith's hand. I didn't know how to react, so I didn't. I just quietly sat there. He literally left his hand on my thigh the whole time for the rest of the lunch. Finally, the bell rang and I bolted for the door without even saying goodbye. I avoided Mr. Smith the rest of the time I went to that school, and luckily I didn't have any other creepy encounters with him. But I'll never forget what I went through during lunch during that portion of the school year. Number 6. This happened to me when I was only in the 6th grade. At this point, I was already beginning to develop. My normal teacher was going to be gone for a few months due to a medical situation they were dealing with. We ended up getting a substitute to fill in for us. He ended up being a middle-aged man. He immediately gave me weird, creepy vibes. He just seemed so fidgety and restless, almost like he was just uncomfortable being around children. Because of this, it made me uncomfortable as well. I always caught him staring at me. It's like he would give me special attention, and this certainly didn't help how I felt about him. He would always call on me even if I didn't have my hand raised. I didn't notice any of the other children in my class being given the same level of attention I was. Things progressed, and eventually he would start making remarks about the way I was dressed. He would say my shirt was too high or my shorts were too short when they were clearly longer than my fingertips when I had my hands to my sides. This went on for a while. He would continue to stare and make remarks about how I dressed. Finally, I felt uncomfortable enough to tell my mom what was going on. Both my mom and dad are very protective over me. My parents got in touch with the school and set up a meeting with both the principal and the substitute teacher. I'm not sure exactly what happened in that meeting, but apparently the teacher kept changing his story and got caught up in telling a few lies. The end result was that I never saw that teacher ever again, much to my relief. Number 7. When I was in 7th grade, I had a computer lab class. It was honestly pretty boring overall, and we spent a lot of time learning things that most of us already knew. Mr. K was the teacher for that class. He was definitely a weird guy and just seemed socially awkward, but none of us cared. He was just our teacher anyway. Well, he went from acting awkward to doing things that were definitely a bit questionable. I started hearing rumors from other girls in my class that he would gently rub their shoulders when he came up behind them to check on their work. Others started noticing him looking down the shirts of some of the girls. Things went on this way for a while, and it was mostly just rumors among the students. But eventually we began noticing something else odd that was happening. Every time a student would ask to use the restroom, Mr. K would go sit at his computer. The reason this was odd was because Mr. K never sat at his computer any other time. After he did this enough times, we started to notice and made a note of it. Without fail, he did it each and every time. This is when the students began to speculate that Mr. K had some type of hidden camera in the restroom. We came up with a plan for one of us to use the restroom and check for one. A boy in my class decided to take on this task. After he returned from the restroom, he said he discovered what looked like to be a lens in the ceiling above the toilet. Shortly after the boy returned from the restroom and told us this, Mr. K briefly left the classroom. The boy went to the principal's office after class and reported what he saw. The bathroom was inspected, but there was no camera found. We became convinced that while Mr. K was watching the camera feed, he saw that the boy discovered the camera and went to remove it right after the boy got back to class. Because there wasn't any proof, Mr. K continued teaching. After I left that school, I heard a rumor that Mr. K had been fired for some reason, but as far as I know, this was only a rumor and wasn't true. By the time I was in high school, a girl I was friends with finally admitted to me that she saw another girl in our class being groped by Mr. K, but she was too scared at the time to say anything. I do remember seeing this particular girl walk into our class one day crying, with her clothing a bit messed up. Looking back now, the things Mr. K was doing truly disgust me, and what's even worse is how he always seemed to get away with it. It's truly sickening. Number 8. When I was in 9th grade, I had a very weird experience with a teacher. His name was Mr. Hains. He was our English teacher, and shortly into the beginning of the school year, he began to creep a lot of us out. It seemed like he took every possible opportunity to start talking about the weirdest things. After reading a poem to us, he managed to somehow turn it into him talking about how he abducted certain types of girls, describing what many of his own students looked like. Of course, he would always say it was some type of fiction that he was describing to us, but he would do it in a very morbid way. He would go from stone-faced to having this evil-looking grin on his face, like he was describing his darkest fantasies. Well, halfway through the school year, I had to transfer schools when my family moved. At first, I was very upset about having to leave my friends, but later on, I became very grateful. Towards the end of the school year, I found out that Mr. Hains ended up getting arrested. It was discovered that he had inappropriate pictures of children on his computer, and apparently he had entered into a relationship with one of his female students who was a minor. It still makes me shiver whenever I think about how much time I spent around a person like that. Unbelievable. Number 9. Back when I was in 5th grade, we ended up having a substitute gym teacher for a period of time. When I first met him, I immediately had a bad feeling. I've always been very in tune with my feelings, and if I felt something wrong was in my guts, I paid attention to it. Well, I had this feeling from the very beginning. Every day in gym class, this man would give me a bad feeling. He always seemed to be watching us, which was normal, but he did it in a way that made me very uncomfortable. Eventually, it was from creepy staring to him subtly touching the girls. Sometimes he would just put his hand on one of the girls' shoulders, and other times he would put his arm around one of them. My best friend and I noticed this quickly and always did our best to stay as far away from the teacher as possible, and to be out of sight whenever it was possible. Things came to a head one day when the teacher came up behind my friend and I and put his arm around her. Half startled and half repulsed, she immediately flipped out and threw his arm off of her and spun away from him. From that point on, we went to even further lengths to stay away from him. Sometimes we would literally hide behind things just to avoid him. We began hearing rumors that he began touching the girls in even more inappropriate ways, but at the time they were just rumors. My friend and I kept to ourselves and didn't really interact with anyone else, which was all part of the effort of avoiding the teacher. All of the girls in my class were very young and they were all terrified of this man. Because of that, I believe that's why no one reported him sooner. But things eventually escalated and the teacher was touching girls in areas that no young girl should ever be touched. Finally, when our regular gym teacher returned from her break, one of the girls broke down and told her what the substitute had been doing. This opened the door to many of the girls also sharing what happened to them. My friend and I were lucky and never really had to suffer what the other girls did, but with enough girls willing to confess everything that had been going on, eventually charges were brought against the man. He ended up being convicted for the things he was doing to the girls and was given a long sentence in prison. To this day, I just hope none of the girls ended up with any permanent emotional damage. That kind of thing can destroy you. Number 10. This happened to me just after graduating from high school. Because of where my birthday landed, I was 17 when I graduated. Since I was no longer a student at the school, I became friends with some of the teachers online. One of the people I became friends with was a young teacher named Mr. Howard. He had been at the school for a few years at this point and was a trusted individual. One day we got to talking and he mentioned how there was going to be a get-together coming up on the weekend for the students that had just graduated, and that a few faculty members would be there as well, including him. He invited me to be a part of it, and being the naive teenager that I was, I accepted. Up until this point, I had never really had anything bad or even creepy happen to me, so I wasn't very aware of how weird this might have sounded to certain people. Due to some bad luck, I ended up without a ride to the event, which was about a half an hour away. Mr. Howard offered to give me a ride, and I regrettably accepted his offer. After he picked me up, he greeted me and we began heading to the get-together. The first real red flag was when he said, "You're 18, right?" I responded by telling him that I was still 17. He looked a bit disappointed but just continued driving without saying much more. The rest of the car ride was pretty quiet and got pretty awkward. Once we got to the restaurant that the get-together was at, I got out of the car. Mr. Howard took my hand and kind of rushed me towards the door. I looked around to see if any of my classmates were waiting outside for us, but I didn't see anyone at all. Once inside, we got a table just for the two of us, and I still didn't see anyone else that I knew. It was at this point I knew he made everything up and there was no plan for us to hang out with my other classmates. He began being very suggestive to me. He would try to hold my hand or put his hand on my leg. I excused myself to go to the restroom and texted my mom. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible for her to come and get me, but I did tell her to call me in 2 minutes and gave her very specific instructions. I got back to the table and sat down, and just like clockwork, my phone rang. I answered the phone and my mom was absolutely freaking out, yelling about how there was an emergency and that I needed to come home immediately. It was loud enough for Mr. Howard to hear. I acted freaked out but apologetic to Mr. Howard and told him that we would have to reschedule, pretending I was actually interested in seeing him again. This apparently worked because he drove me home without incident. I feel very dumb for allowing myself to be put in this position. I made sure to block him on everything online and I reported him to the police and to the school, but I don't believe anything ever came of it. These days I am much more careful when it comes to how I handle myself in situations like these. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you have your own personal scary story, please send it my way at southerncannibal@gmail.com. Now, before we bring this to a close, let me give a special thank you and shout out to all my $5 or more patrons that are also featured on screen alongside my $3 patrons. So huge shout outs to Yulisa, Babe Lincoln, Beth A, Kate E, Carrie B, Celeste S, Courtney T, Ellie S, Howard R, Jacqueline W, Jazzy G, Jennifer M, Jess, Jonathan C, Catherine M, Carrie F, Matthew B, Michael G, Random Randy, Steph L, Tammy S, and Terry H. Thank all of you so much for your support. And if you'd like to join these awesome people and also become a patron, head over to my Patreon at patreon.com/southerncannibal. Thanks everyone, and have a good one. And remember to always stay on.